Good morning, everybody. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person for this incredibly important event. I meet regularly with victims and survivors and their families, people who've lived through violent crime. And the public health impact of gun violence is evident, it is devastating, and for all too many, it's permanent. As the director of an agency whose principal focus is to respond to and reduce violent crime, I'm often asked two questions. What causes gun violence? And can we actually solve this problem? These are hard questions and crucial ones, and I'm not going to pretend to have all the answers. I applaud you here today in taking on these tough questions, because gun violence is not just a law enforcement problem, it is absolutely a public health problem. At ATF, our number one priority is public safety. It's what guides every single decision that I make, and really that all of our special agents, inspectors, regulators, intelligence analysts, and investigators make. Every single one of us is reminded on a daily basis of just how large a challenge we have ahead of us in terms of tackling gun violence. But convenings like these, like this one that you're at today, bring us closer to creative and new solutions. And therefore, they bring us that hope that Mr. Dowling was talking about, the hope that real change is actually possible and change is needed. Because the level of gun violence in this country is simply unacceptable. And like you, we here at ATF, we refuse to accept it as some sort of status quo that will persist into the future. We refuse to accept the notion that it's somehow who we are as Americans or part of our national story or our culture. It is not. It is distinctly un-American. ATF is a small agency with a big task, and our success hinges on our partnerships for that reason. Every day, our agents are out there working side by side with state, local, tribal, and federal law enforcement partners to help make an impact in communities across the country, trying to drive down gun violence. But those aren't our only partners, right? At a recent roundtable discussion I attended with victims and survivors and their families, one of the people there, one woman at the table, I remember her asking, what are you supposed to do when you've never been involved in the justice system before and your child has been murdered and they tell you there's no suspect? What do you even start to do next? And she added, to me and my family, and I remember this is horrible, this was the most important case, but sometimes there's so many, it just feels like our kid is just a number. Americans and victims and survivors are not numbers. Now, in general, Americans don't often hear these individual and heart-wrenching stories from victims and survivors or their families. And I would call it America's everyday gun violence crisis, what doesn't get on TV. What we hear most often about are these incredibly tragic mass casualty events. To make them news now, it seems like shootings have to claim a certain number of lives are injured in order to somehow break through. And that is a tragedy. Because, of course, attention should always be drawn to those events, but we need to remember that gun violence claims more than 109 lives every single day across America. At least 109 every single day. And we need to ensure that the deaths of one or two by guns is not somehow considered mundane or ordinary or just a number. I heard somebody in the media recently say that they thought that Americans were, quote, numb to this issue. Well, I refuse to believe that we are desensitized as a country to the impact that gun violence is having on our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, and our families every single day. We are all here because we, the people here in this room, are not numb, because we believe that we can and we need to do better. And the scope and scale of the problem requires an all of the above, all hands on deck response. While law enforcement cannot solve this crisis alone, we can and we will partner to make progress. At ATF, we're using every tool at our disposal to help prevent and respond to gun violence. And we're turning to data to guide us in our efforts more than ever. ATF recently published the second volume of a 4-part report called the National Firearms Commerce and Trafficking Assessment. The President and the Attorney General directed ATF to conduct this study since the last one was put out more than 20 years ago. And now, of course, technology and trends have certainly changed over those 2 decades. This second volume analyzes specifically America's crime gun data, and it does it for 5 years from 2017 to 2021. Much of this data had never been previously publicly available, and it provides more information on America's crime guns, those are the guns used or associated with crimes, than has ever been compiled in one place, ever, full stop. Those findings and that data will help us all understand new trends and emerging threats, including those posed by new technologies, so that law enforcement, public health officials, and policymakers can adjust accordingly. Now, the second volume is 700 pages long, and it has a lot in there, and I hope you'll all dig into it. But I want to share a couple, maybe 3 highlights with you from the things in that volume. First, the report shows that in that 5-year period, 2017 to 2021, there were more than 1 million guns stolen from private individuals. And those are just the ones that are reported. So there's a lot more than that. This is a nationwide problem with a solution. Please think about this and help us at ATF to come up with creative ways to remind law-abiding gun owners about their responsibility to safely secure their firearms. Look, they don't want their firearms stolen, and they certainly don't want them stolen and used in violent crime. Nobody breaks into a car and steals a gun to go hunting. These things are ending up on the streets and ending up hurting people. Now, I understand that the next panel is going to talk about the public health awareness campaigns and how they can have an effect on changing behavior. And safe storage of firearms is a worthy ad campaign issue. It's worked, and it can work more if we work on it more. The second point I want to highlight is about the threat we face to fully automatic weapons, machine guns. Now, with a few exceptions, new machine guns have been illegal in this country for decades. By law, these weapons, some of which, by the way, can shoot over 1,000 bullets a minute or more, are reserved for the military and government. Yet now, some have misused new technology to create little devices that just in seconds can convert a semi-automatic weapon, which is legal. That means you have to pull the trigger one time every time you expel a single bullet, to a machine gun, which is illegal. Machine guns, fully automatic weapons, you pull the trigger and it keeps on firing at that high rate. Now, let me be clear, making, selling, and just having these kind of machine gun conversion devices is against the law. And Congress knew almost 100 years ago, in the days of Al Capone, that fully automatic weapons were, as they put it, quote, unusually dangerous to the public and to law enforcement. They have no place in our communities. Unfortunately, as I've traveled across the nation, talking to law enforcement and other leaders, I've heard that these devices are quite literally flooding our communities. Now, data from this recently published report confirms that threat. From that 5-year period, 2017 to 2021, the number of machine gun conversion devices that law enforcement agencies reported being recovered has increased by an alarming 570%. This is a problem also that needs to be focused on immediately. And the final point that I'll share from the report is about what we call the, quote, time to crime. Now, that is the number we talk about when we're talking about the length of time, the number of days from the moment that a firearm is legally purchased to the time it's actually recovered in a crime. By the way, it might have been used even before that in a different crime. But the report shows that in this country, this time to crime number is shrinking, and that's a problem. In fact, in that same 5-year period, nearly 25% of traced crime guns, that's more than 366,000 guns, had a time to crime of less than a single year. That means 1 out of every 4 crime guns recovered by law enforcement and traced shows that it had just recently been purchased legally in the past year and then made its way to that crime. A time to crime of under 1 year is an indicator of what we call straw purchasing. Now, straw purchasing is when somebody buys a gun for somebody else who's not allowed to have it. Because of legislative actions like the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, we now have additional tools available to us at ATF to investigate and recommend for prosecution people who engage in this straw purchasing and firearms trafficking. That legislation also provides multiple agencies, including the Justice Department's Office of Justice Programs, with significant grant funding opportunities to address violence in your communities and help people who want to intervene and prevent it. Now, you'll get the opportunity later this morning, I saw on your agenda, to hear from a great leader in that regard, Amy Solomon. She leads that office, the Office of Justice Programs. The findings from the Crime Gun Report, and I just gave you a couple, are truly invaluable. That data helps law enforcement, policymakers, public health officials like you, and people out there in the communities who want to fight this problem to know where to target their limited resources, where creativity is needed. This type of violent crime, the type we're seeing that's experienced across our country, it's not uniform, right? Different regions, different states, towns, they experience gun crime differently. And using data to inform policing, policymaking, and public health will have a huge impact, not just nationally, but in individual communities. And the report can be broken down by state and even by city. The challenges are great, but I do join Mr. Dowling. I do believe that there are more of us who want to do right than those who are seeking to do harm. Sometimes we're just a little too quiet about it. But when I join in events like this, I'm optimistic that we can work together to lower gun violence. Look, now is not the time for silence. Now is the time for partnership. Now is the time for energy. Now is the time for creativity. Now is the time to fight. To fight gun crime, to fight for our kids, and to fight for our nation's future. Thank you all for having me here today, and thank you for your commitment to gun violence prevention. I wish you a wonderful day, a creative day, and a day that has impact.